Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good evening. Welcome back to INX Prime's G20 coverage. So this evening we're taking it a bit more academic. So I've got the former Turkish ambassador to South Africa and also the honorary professor of practice at UJ, Ayşegül Kandaş, who will be joining me. And later on in the show, we'll also be joined by another professor, which is Gustavo De Carvalho, to speak more on an academic side when it comes to the G20. We know for the last few days the G20 has been in the news. And as we say in South Africa, Kinako, the time is here. In just a few hours, so many of the heads of states are going to be making their way to the historic Nasrec on the outskirts of Soweto, where the Leaders Summit will be taking place for the first time on African soil. And as South Africans, we should be feeling really proud of what's happening on the African continent and in South Africa in particular. But before we start and have more conversations on this, I'd like to welcome Ayşegül Kandaş to the show. Former Ambassador, good evening. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Thank you for welcoming.
From a diplomatic lens and from your experience as a professor also, how significant is it for South Africa to host such a huge multilateral meeting in South Africa, in Africa for the first time?
First of all, since I live here now, I'm also proud of South Africa and for hosting and working on it for a whole year. I know how difficult it is to organize a multilateral gathering of 20 states, but it's more than 60 states now. I have witnessed during my time as ambassador BRICS, but this is much bigger than BRICS. And South Africa is very experienced in organizing such multilateral gatherings, I should say. In that respect, I think South Africa, DIRCO, and everybody else, the presidency, everybody else who is involved in the organization is doing a good job. It's very important, logistically, protocol-wise, and everything, and that's a big part of the whole thing. But South Africa's holding this event is also important for the continent, as we have always been talking about up until now. It is important for the continent. It is important for providing a platform for other countries, especially like the biggest 20 economies of the world, providing a platform for them to have the bilateral meetings, to have the opportunity to get together with other countries. So there's a lot of diplomacy that will be going on. It is not only about the priorities of G20, it is also about side deals, let's say, between the business, the business people of those 20 countries plus, 20 plus, I should say, and also of all the agreements and other important talks that will be going on a bilateral basis. So in that respect, it's also important because those countries, those heads of state will also use this opportunity to get together with their counterparts. It's more practical than having a huge bilateral visit to that country. It saves time and it is very practical, and that's what heads of state use these occasions for usually.
You mentioned something very important regarding business deals that take place on the side. We've seen the B20 taking place a few days ago. We've seen the social 20 taking place as well. But from a business point of view, you probably have experience in your previous role as the former ambassador. How difficult is it getting different companies and different companies from different countries to sit together and talk to get these deals going?
So as you know, generally there are B2B meetings. B2B meetings, companies always come. Turkish companies, let's say, come to South Africa, have B2B meetings. It's not that difficult as government officials getting together. There is not much protocol involved. So business always has a way of getting together for, making deals. In that respect, I heard even the United States is represented by a powerful business delegation here. So in that respect, it's easy for them. They always look for opportunities to get together. Business to be business. They speak the same language. And it is important for maybe government states to send the biggest or most important companies of their countries, like to send high-level delegations, the CEOs of really prominent companies that want to make deals with South Africa, let's say, or the other G20 countries.
I think it's so important you mentioned the B2B, but joining us now via Zoom is Gustavo De Carvalho from the South African Institute for International Affairs. Gustavo, good evening. Welcome to INX Prime.
Hi, good evening. Thank you very much for having me here.
So we know that the G20 Leaders Summit takes place in just a few hours now. We can see the preparations all over Johannesburg. I don't think Johannesburg has ever looked so good in a very long time. The last time I remember Joburg looking so clean and spruced up was just before the 2010 Soccer World Cup. But from an international relations and governance perspective, what does the summit represent for the Global South?
Thank you so much. And I think there has been an interesting sequencing of Global South countries chairing the G20. We had Indonesia, then we had India, then we had Brazil, and now we have South Africa. To a large extent, I think what we see at the moment for the last 4 years is a number of initiatives that look not only in terms of increasing global economic governance, but also looking into issues like inequalities, issues around representation. For instance, the African Union now is a full member of the G20. And all of those in a very convoluted geopolitical environment provide us an opportunity to really look into what are ways in which this changing world can become more representative, can become more influential in terms of representing the needs of countries like African countries and the rest of the Global South.
So you mentioned something about more representation. It's so important that we see Global South countries, and as you rightly mentioned, we've seen BRICS taking such an important role in the world. We've seen BRICS also coming up to be such a bigger organization compared to when it just started off. With the G20 being in South Africa, with so many BRICS nations being involved in it as well, how do you see the policies and the different agendas that's going to come out from this? Will it be more focused towards Global South countries, especially when it comes to geopolitical issues, especially when it comes to looking after the interests of African countries, of the not so rich countries that are part of the G20?
You're absolutely right. And I think if we're looking to the representation of the G20, there is an interesting triangle that occurs there. You have BRICS countries, you have G7 countries that largely compose what is the G20. If we're looking to one of the most important and the most difficult issues that have been in discussions this year within the G20, it has to do about, for instance, debt sustainability, about cost, access to markets, for instance, of developing countries. If we look, African countries tend to, when they need loans for infrastructures, for important projects for them, they tend to pay far more interest rates than what developed countries would. So a lot of these discussions are important because it is we need to identify important ways for the global economies not only to include more countries, but also to define solutions and to find ways in which that those will become more relevant for the countries that are members of that. And in that sense, having a number of BRICS countries that are members of G20, that matters, because that provides more influence, that increases the pressure, but also, even if not all of those issues will be resolved this year in the South African G20, that creates a way in which a lot of those conversations will continue within the G20, but also in other forums.
Gustavo, South Africa has emphasized inclusive growth, reform of global financial institutions, and just energy transition. So which of these priorities do you believe will gain the most traction at the summit, and why?
I think it's important for us to look into the energy transition, for instance. If we look into the increasing demand for energy that exists at the moment, both because countries are developing themselves, but also we have a whole new wave of demand for energy that comes from data centers, artificial intelligence. If we're looking to all of the different aspects of the G20, whether we're talking about B20 this week, whether we're talking about the social 20, we're all trying to find better ways to tackle the climate issues that are ongoing there, but also at the same time find new ways in which that can be done. That for me, it provides an enormous opportunity for G20 countries really to identify new approaches, new coordination, new collaborations. Certainly one of the most difficult ones to be resolved, but it's one that will continue at the center of the discussions during the summit.
Gustavo, just speaking about, you mentioned AI, you mentioned speaking about the importance of moving forward and seeing a very changed world. So many people and so many organizations and analysts have also mentioned how multilateral institutions are becoming a bit outdated. What reforms could be on the table or should be on the table for the G20 to still remain relevant?
This is an important question because, to a large extent, and the challenges that we have been seeing in recent months around the ability of the G20 to tackle some of those issues, it relates to what kind of institutions do we want to deal with common challenges. We live in a space where multilateral institutions face a crisis of both legitimacy and credibility in terms of, and the very G20 itself was created and was strengthened as the aftermath of the financial crisis of 2008. There are a number of issues that G20 needs to consider if it wants to remain as a relevant institution for global economic governance. I think one of them is dealing with how do we deal with a group that manages its decisions by consensus? And that remains, I think, one of the challenges. Are we looking for an institution that it's always looking for minimum common denominators, or how do we address that? Another issue, I think it has to do with the very trust that its own members have around the G20 itself. And I think the challenges of not having the United States fully represented within the G20 does create an impact for that. I think for its members, it's important that they look for options and ways in which strengthen the ability of the G20 of dealing with these issues, and looking into those is not just an accessory for the G20, but it's critical for the survival of its own mission and mandate.
Speaking about having common goals that the different countries have, and you correctly mentioned the United States are not going to be here, and that's been a very distracting sideshow for the last few days or the last few hours, especially with some of the comments that have come out from United States, as well as the comments coming out from South Africa. I think that's a bit of a sideshow that we could do without. But we do have a G20 with different agendas from the different countries. As you correctly mentioned earlier on, we have the G7 countries, we've got the BRICS countries. We do know South Africa, Turkey, Brazil, India, probably China as well, have all pushed for a global South empowerment in multilateral spaces. What aligned interests do you foresee these states bringing into the G20, especially knowing that probably the world's biggest economy is not going to be here?
Yeah, look, while the United States may not be represented, I think we need to stop seeing G20 just as the summit. Of course, what is happening this week in Johannesburg is important, but this has been a year-long process of discussions from foreign ministries, from Sherpas, negotiations that are ongoing. I think what is important for the members that are present within the G20 this year is really to double down on the importance of the group. The reason why, and as I mentioned earlier, why the G20 became so important in the aftermath of the financial crisis of 2008 is that we had an understanding that in order to manage global economic governance issues, we needed the coordination and cooperation of the largest economies in the world and the most important economies in the world. In a space where we are right now, whether these are members of the G7, whether they are members of BRICS, or whether they are members of none of those, but are part of the G20, it is important that they showcase support to the group and find ways in which the decisions and solutions can be made to tackle geopolitical and geoeconomic issues that are becoming increasingly impactful for the global economy and for countries, whether they're coming from the global south or the global north. So this is indeed an opportunity for showcasing not only collaboration and solidarity, but really to provide support to ensure that institutions like the G20 remain relevant in dealing with global crises.
Gustavo, Africa's continental issues like debt distress, infrastructure gaps, climate vulnerability are often spoken about but rarely acted on. So, what concrete commitments do you think the AU should demand? And do you think Africa as a continent and AU inside the G20 will be able to get those, not in terms of really like a talk shop and empty words, but real commitments?
Absolutely, and despite the African Union having joined the G20 2 years ago, we yet to see a stronger presence of the AU in that regard. On the one hand, is perhaps expected, considering that it does take some time to get adjusted to it. But I would say the issue about debt, the stress that we're seeing currently by a lot of African countries is indeed an important issue. Because if we look for the fact that while many of African economies are perhaps some of the most vulnerable economies in the world when it comes to the to the levels and capabilities of dealing with their debt. We still see a situation where the access to markets, credit ratings, and even when it comes to the very imbalance that exists in international markets, it is something that it needs to be dealt with. So certainly it is something that we would expect a stronger work from the G20. And when it comes to if we're looking to how African countries have been presenting and looking into their own future development, it does provide also an opportunity of looking into how do we strengthen continental initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Area, like the implementation of the Pan-African payments and settlement systems, as important ways not only of dealing with those issues as a matter of charity, but also as an issue of enhancing the development of a region that has enormous potential, that has 1.5 billion people, and perhaps becomes the potential new frontier of global economic integration. And I think the G20 can become a very important platform for that.
So important what you mentioned, the G20 can become such an important platform. We do know South Africa is probably Africa's largest economy. We've got the best infrastructure. It's the most developed country in Africa. How can South Africa position itself as a bridge between the G20 and other African countries?
Indeed, and I think that's largely the role that South Africa has played with the G20, not only during its presidency, but also in previous years. When South Africa trades between 30 and 40 billion dollars a year with the rest of the continent, and perhaps becomes the most important hub in terms of trade within the African continent. South Africa has a lot to offer, not just from the ideological perspective of Pan-African solidarity, but really to identify new ways in which to do that. I think it was important that South Africa brought many African voices within the G20 processes, not only in terms of the summits now, with many African countries being invited as guests, but also throughout the year. And I think it is important to utilize this dual role, that dual presence of African countries through South Africa and the African Union, to ensure that Africa is not only seen as an afterthought, or not only that we're talking about Africa, but we're talking to Africa. So certainly South Africa plays an important role in terms of ensuring that there is more visibility to the African continent, but also that we see much more tangible results that can influence and support a strengthened role of the African continent in global economic affairs.
Gustavo, from SAIIA's research perspective, we know that you have done a lot of work about BRICS, and now you are following G20. From the research perspective of SAIIA, and as a senior researcher there, how would you measure, let's say, the success of South Africa in hosting G20? What are the indicators? For instance, would it be an indicator to have a summit declaration, to have a president's statement, not to have a declaration? Would these be indicators of the success of G20 this year? Or would you look at other indicators as time goes by, let's say? Obviously, you can't measure it right now, but I'm really curious about your thoughts on this.
I think that is an interesting question, because there is always the risk that we may not have a declaration at the end of the summit. So, of course, the United States is not being represented there, which potentially changes somehow that. But I think, as you mentioned, perhaps is not the most important aspect in here. I think even if we do have a declaration, I think we need to look into what is the willingness of its own member states to be able to implement those decisions. I think there has been some important indicators of important conversations that will continue with or without the declaration. And I would say perhaps highlighting the high-level panel on global inequality that was called by South Africa and headed by Joseph Stiglitz. That, in a way, I think what it does provide, it is a space for changing of discussions and dialogue when it comes to global economic governance, that it provides a continuation of issues that will continue not only within the G20, but also in other forums like BRICS, but also that it provides a much stronger understanding and assessment of what are some of the fragility aspects of the global economy that needs to be dealt with if we want a global economy that is more resilient, that is a global economy that is more inclusive, but also a global economy that is more responsive to different types of crises and needs. And I think that, for me, when we look into the G20 more as a process rather than just an event that led to its members throughout the year to have important discussions around some of the most difficult and important issues in the global economy. That, for me, I think it's perhaps some of the most important highlights that I would say from the year of the presidency of South Africa within the G20.
Thank you so much, Gustavo. I think this is a really, really important point you made there. Just getting to see what will make it successful as a G20 summit held on the African continent for the first time. Gustavo, before I let you go, and Ambassador, before I let you go, let me get to Gustavo first. What gives you hope heading into this weekend's G20 Leaders Summit?
I think I was looking earlier into the arrival of heads of states, and it reminded me of, despite a lot of the distraction and attention towards the presence or not of the United States here, we still see the largest economies in the world still being very supportive to the process of the G20, showcasing support not only to the discussions that South Africa has led, but also to South Africa itself. And I think for me that it's something important for us to remind ourselves that despite some of those issues and challenges, there is still a lot of expectations and a lot of support to this process that are not South Africa's process, but really a process that South Africa has been steering and that most of the world economy is still very supportive of. And that perhaps I wanted to end with a slightly more positive note here that there is still some space for us to be hopeful around the state of the global economy.
Thank you so much. Ambassador, what's the hope that you have going into this weekend's G20?
So it's the hope in diplomacy, I have to say, because these gatherings, the multilateral platforms and forums, are also now showing us more so than ever the importance of diplomacy and dialogue. At a time when we are going through a transitional phase in the world and in international affairs, at a time when the world seems to be so fragmented, at a time when diplomacy doesn't seem to work at times, and where negotiation and mediation somehow started to lose its power, a platform like this, all these heads of state, businesses, everyone coming to a city in Africa, I think gives me hope. First time ever in Africa, that's second. And also to have the visibility of Africa, African Union being for the first time inside the G20 platform, to have the visibility of Africa enhanced is very important, I think. So these are hopeful, and to see that there is so much talk going on and so many presentations done. Thought leaders are there, media is there, so there is a focus. The light is shining on South Africa. The focus is on global problems and especially the problems of Africa. Whether we have a declaration, a summit declaration, a statement or not, I think at that moment is not as important as all those dialogues and meetings we are going to have and we have had in the past few days and what we will see tomorrow. I think these are more important, to have diplomacy on the table, to have the power of diplomacy there, because unless the leaders speak to each other, unless the leaders come together, it is hard to solve the biggest problems of the world. Implementation is another story. How powerful is G20 in terms of decision making and implementing is another story, of course, but the hope is still there.
Former Ambassador Ayşegül Kandaş, Gustavo De Carvalho, thank you guys so much for joining us today. It was really important, really interesting points you've put through. And yes, we're on the cusp of the G20 Leaders Summit. I think so many years of preparation has gone into this. We've known about this. We've been speaking about this for the last 12 months, just making sure we get to this point. As Ambassador mentioned in the beginning of the program, we had BRICS in South Africa, we've had World Cups in South Africa, but somehow this one here feels really, really important. To our viewers out there, remember to tune into the INX social pages from tomorrow morning as well as Sunday as we bring you the latest from Nasrec, where I'll be on the ground there trying to mingle with media from all over the world. I know we're not going to get very close to many of the leaders, which we'd love to have gotten to, but we do know the security is very, very tight. We are living in a bit of a hard lockdown, not a COVID lockdown, but a traffic lockdown at the moment. But the roads, everything looks to be absolutely spick and span in Johannesburg at the moment. It just has a good feeling. It's giving us feelings of the 2010 World Cup again. It's giving us that patriotism that we South Africans so love. And as South Africans, no matter which side of the political fence we sit on, as media practitioners, as just general South African citizens, we should be very, very proud of our country and what we are achieving as a tiny state in the southern tip of Africa. For myself, former Ambassador Ayşegül Kandaş, thank you so much for joining us and good evening.